What were your thoughts with the NFL pushing this virtual draft, which was very unique and very different?
Firstly, I think one of the weird things is a lot of people are saying, why did they do it? But the reality is I don't think anybody in the NFL or anywhere, to say the least, knows what's going to happen. And if they had pushed this draft and waited, and then all of a sudden, the situation of the country was resolved, the NFL would have been caught not having done what they needed to have a season. So they were forced to do this. I think they did the best in a weird situation. And I know I've spoken to a number of teams, and they've told me that they think this will change the way that things are done for them in the future. They'll do a lot more virtual meetings, and they believe they won't have to send as many people on the road every fall scouting. So I think in the long term, there are going to be some benefits achieved by teams in the league by having to adjust to this weird situation.
Do you think the virtual draft was a big contribution to why there weren't a lot of big trades in the first round? None in the top 10 at all, and really not a lot of big ones.
I think it probably played a little bit of a role, but I think it played more of a role is there were a few players like Burrow and Chase Young, which from what I was told, there was no way either of the first two picks was moving unless one of those teams got blown out of the water with an offer. And because of the depth of the draft, I think a lot of teams were hesitant to make a gigantic offer to move up there because there's so many quality players after the first round. So I think that played a big part in it. I think the virtual draft played a little bit, but not as big as people are making it out to be.
You see a talent like CeeDee Lamb falling to number 17 with the Cowboys. And there are a lot of Cowboy fans that didn't like that pick, which I have no idea why they didn't like that pick. This guy was one of the most explosive wide receivers we've seen come out of the draft since really Julio Jones. You were just saying there are a lot of players that fall year in and year out. Were you surprised this year that a lot of great players fell into the second round and some in the third round?
Not dramatically. I really wasn't that dramatically shocked. And the reason being is there was so much talent in the draft. And you have to remember that almost every team's draft board is going to look very different because we all play different schemes. The coaches have different coaching styles, which you're going to see different players learning styles better. So the birds are going to look dramatically different. So when you have a lot of talent in the draft and so many different birds, you're going to see some good players slide. If it was a draft with a overall talent in the top 70 players, you might not have seen some of those guys like a Grant Delpit slide down into the second round. He might have been at the bottom of the first round guy. But there's so much talent that teams can get nitpicky and say, yeah, he doesn't fit exactly what we do. We're going to go with someone that's just as talented at a different position.
How much did the metrics of the combine and just athletic metrics determine how much you liked a player and thought they could succeed in the NFL? Was it a large percentage? Was it half and half kind of thing? How much did that factor in?
It's not anywhere near half and half. I would say the metrics are probably a 5 to 10% part of it. I was just speaking to somebody actually yesterday, higher up with an NFL team, and his exact description of it to me was, hey, the combine and the numbers, those are great. Just to sort of double check, if you as a staff, everybody says this guy's an elite athlete and he tests poorly at the combine, it means you as a staff have to go watch the film and make sure, hey, what we saw is great athleticism, we weren't falling in love with maybe his production and his toughness, and vice versa. If the guy tests off the charts, and was not really explosive or dynamic player in college, you go back and watch the film to make sure, hey, are we missing something? And is there a reason this guy tested so much better than his production or than what we saw on film? And it's really just a cross-check. If you base a lot of your grade on just those numbers with the combine, there's a good chance you're going to be drafting poorly and drafting in the top 10 up pretty regularly.
Russ, you were part of the 92 to 98 Rams. The greatest show on turf. You talk about Kurt Warner and some of the great wide receivers they had on the team, and you were a part of that. You helped draft some of these players. You helped scout some of these players. What were your thoughts to the Rams organization in that time when they were growing into a championship competitive team?
The organization had a big lift when Coach Vermeil came there, and he brought in Charlie Army as the sort of head of scouting. Prior to Coach Vermeil, the organization as a whole, not just scouting and coaching, was not always focused on how we win every day. For a lot of different people that were just content with, if we lose, it's okay because we're working in professional football. And Vermeil got everybody to start focusing on the right direction. Charlie Army got things much more organized in terms of the scouting department. And those two people really made a dramatic difference in allowing the Rams to become successful.
What points of emphasis do you think you've changed within scouting, whether it's offensive or defensive players, from the time you were with the Rams from 94 to 98 to today?
The big there's more emphasis now on above the shoulders, the mental makeup, the emotional intelligence. I think that's something that as the game has gotten more complex in terms of offensive schemes, defensive schemes, the checks at the line of scrimmage, the adjustments that need to be made, players have to be quicker mentally. And I think that's something that teams have to investigate much more. It's much harder to have a player come in now that is not particularly bright and doesn't learn well and be able to get him playing very fast. That is a real challenge, and I think that's one of the reasons that scouting is still somewhat of a roll of the dice, because it's hard to figure out what goes on above the shoulder, and it just gets harder and harder as the league becomes more and more complex.
When you look at Tom Brady, he was a 6th-round draft pick, and everybody was talking about, wow, that was a steal, one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game. Were you surprised that Tom Brady changed and really transitioned into the star quarterback he became?
I mean, yeah, I was definitely, when I graded him coming out of Michigan, I did not envision him becoming an all-pro superstar Hall of Famer. I gave him a future starters grade, a 3rd-round grade when he was coming out of Michigan. But there were questions to me, and that again points back to the mental makeup. Some of the things that are hard to see when a quarterback, especially like Tom, was being pulled in and out of a lineup because they had a quarterback named Drew Henson there in Michigan. You didn't get to see how Tom did over 3 or 4 years in college when things went poorly. How did he handle it? How did he adjust to it? What type of leader was he? Those things were hard to tell because he wasn't a 3 or 4 year starter. That's what makes this business great, is that players like that slip through the cracks and get found in the 6th round.
In addition to the Rams, you also went to the Browns later. What were some of the big differences of the way the Rams scouted when you were there? Maybe their points of emphasis versus the Browns? Was it stylistically different? What were some of the comparisons between those two teams? And do you think it's drastically different among every team across the league?
Well, I don't think it's drastically different in terms of how they organize it. I think it's very different in how they structure their board. I would say one of the bigger differences we had at the Browns was that when I first got there, it was very organized. We had people like Dwight Clark was our president and Joe Collins was our director of player personnel, and they were very experienced in the business. Joe had been in it 30 years, so our scouting department was very organized. When we had meetings, they were detail-oriented. And unfortunately, that shifted. While I was there, Joe was replaced by someone who had only worked for literally 1 year as an intern in the NFL, and all of a sudden he was pretty much put in charge of scouting. And we went from being the most organized scouting department I'd ever been a part of to completely disorganized and disjointed, and that was a big part of the problem we had in terms of bringing in consistent talent once Joe Collins was gone.
Is there a particular player that you scouted that became an NFL superstar, and which NFL superstar really stood out to you when you were scouting him?
When I was scouting, I wrote Mark Over, the player that I gave a very high grade to when he was at West Virginia. He came out, was a 6th-round pick, washed out on his first 2 stops in the league with New Orleans and Cincinnati, ended up going to the Rams and becoming a 3 or 4-time quarterback. He was a guy that I really felt had the tools to be special when I saw him at West Virginia, and he proved me correctly. There were so many great players also when I was at the Browns. I was fortunate to scout Bob Sanders at Iowa. And he was probably the one guy of all the players. He may not have been the best I ever saw, but he was the one that jumped out the most on the field. And when you met with him and talked with him, you just knew this guy was a leader, and he was able to handle being a leader of men in an NFL locker room. And that was one of his great traits when he got to the Colts and really proved himself to be a great player, was he was a natural leader, which is very hard to find.
It was a shame with his injuries, I'll tell you that. Bob Sanders was a great player, and he could have been even greater if he didn't get all those injuries really early in his career.
Yeah, there's no doubt. He was a special football player. He was a human missile, threw all over the field, made great plays against the run, was way better in coverage than I think people expected him to be coming out of college. He was a dynamic football player. Not many 5'8" safeties win Defensive Player of the Year, but he did in the NFL. And I think if he had stayed healthy, you might have been talking about a Hall of Fame player.
Are there any hidden gems or maybe lesser-known players that you had to convince teams' scouting staff to look into and eventually draft more that did become great players in the NFL, or even just good players in the NFL?
I think the one guy that I get the most credit for in the NFL is my first year with the Browns. I was on the road, and I went to a school that was not on the list. They didn't have a prospect, supposedly, but I went there because they had a Division I basketball program, which is Drake University. And when I was there, the basketball players, none of them really looked like guys that could make the transition, but they had a place kicker that was not on any list or anything, and I added them to the list for teams to scout because I was doing it for the Browns, but we were part of Bresto, so all my reports were shared with the other teams in Bresto. And the Dallas Cowboys ended up signing Billy Cundiff as a rookie, and he made the team, and he ended up playing 10 or 11 years in the league. And if I hadn't gone to Drake that day, he probably would have never gotten on the list. I mean, never played in the NFL.
You're watching the NFL and developing some of these young quarterbacks, the mobile quarterbacks. Are you surprised that the league has transformed into these mobile quarterbacks from the pocket quarterbacks that nobody expected?
I'm not overly surprised because if you look at all of them, except for maybe Lamar Jackson, who I think is still developing as a natural player, all of them are good passers. You can't be successful in the NFL, regardless whether it's in the pocket or on the move, if you can't throw the ball very accurately. And I think most NFL coaches, even the newer guys that are doing new things with offenses, will tell you that a quarterback who is not accurate still is not going to be successful in the NFL, whether it's on the move or in the pocket. And I think most NFL coaches will tell you, hey, if they have a guy that's accurate and he can move, that's man that does. So of course they want that. So it doesn't surprise me a ton, especially when you look back 20 years ago and guys like Donovan McNabb. He really was able to carry an offense on his back because he had the added ability to get out of the pocket and make plays on the move, in addition to being a good pocket passer. So it's not shocking. Athletes get better and better. Players work harder. Coaches do a better job of utilizing their talent. So it makes a lot of sense that quarterbacks who are athletes are going to be more successful now as long as they can still throw the ball consistently.
Moving on to the CFL, how did the different rules and also the wider field change the way you scout in the CFL, both with Montreal and Calgary that you've been with both teams, in comparison to NFL scouting? What are the biggest differences?
Well, the biggest difference of them all is, unlike the NFL, where we are searching for the greatest players in the world, we have to find the players that are tremendous players with a ton of potential to make game-changing plays that are just not good enough to last long-term in the NFL, but good enough to come up and be dynamic, productive players in the CFL. It's a very hard balance. Oftentimes, we end up with players that are a little smaller and more explosive, but smaller than the NFL would look for, or bigger guys that may not be explosive, but they're so much bigger than a lot of NFL teams would look for a receiver that we sort of make them fit, even though they may not be the prototypical NFL athlete. They work perfectly in Canada. The other thing we have to look for is Canadian players. Half of our roster have to be Canadian citizens.
Wow.
So there's 30 or 40 that are playing in the U.S. every year at colleges. There are also 27 Canadian colleges playing college football. So we have to scout those guys and really grind deep to find good Canadian football players.
The XFL went bankrupt, and everybody was saying how great the rules have transitioned the game of football and that the NFL should look at what the XFL has done with their rules and change their rules. If they want to change some kind of rules, change it to the XFL rules. Were you surprised that after with this pandemic that's going on right now with COVID-19 and them canceling it, that it went bankrupt as well as it did the first couple of weeks it was on?
Yeah, I was really surprised. And in truth, I don't know how much the league's finances itself had to do with the league not surviving. I think it was more the bigger picture of the corporation that owned the XFL. I think the XFL had met most of its targets for financial success going forward. I just think bigger picture, the whole company may have said, we're not going to be able to do well financially if we're spread so thin. Because I think the XFL did a lot of good things. I think their TV numbers were way better than most people thought they would be, even the ones at the end of the season. And I think the football was excellent. I think they did a great job. It's really a shame to see the XFL not there. There's some great people, both coaches, players, and personnel people. They really did a great job of putting that league together.
Are there any players in the CFL right now that are currently stars that you think maybe could make an NFL comeback?
I can't really state how many there are right now, because the ones that were really good in the last year or two, most of them have come down. With Calgary, we had a player named Trey Roberson, another player, Adams, both defensive backs. They both came down for the NFL this year and got legitimate signing bonuses with Green Bay and the Bears, respectively. And I think Trey Roberson is going to be a guy that ends up at some point challenging to be a starting quarterback for the Chicago Bears. Every year there's probably 8 to 10 guys that get signed. They get real money to come down and sign and have a legit chance to be contributing players in the NFL. And then another 10 or 15 sign with the hope that they can stick as backups. There's a lot more talent in the CFL than American fans would know, and that's why they need to watch the games on ESPN, because there really is a ton of talent up in Canada.